King Charles spent a short period of time in hospital today.
King Charles's doctor just revealed tragic news that's left Britain reeling. King Charles's condition has taken a sudden, devastating turn, one the palace tried to keep quiet until now.
But I've always felt that we're over-exploiting and damaging.
Royal insiders are in tears, emergency meetings have been called, and the entire world is asking the same question. What really happened inside Buckingham Palace tonight? When the official announcement came, it cut through the calm. King Charles's health had taken a tragic turn.
I am deeply aware of this great inheritance and of the duties and heavy responsibilities of sovereignty.
That simple line carried weight far beyond its words. It signaled that what had been quietly managed behind closed doors had now become a public crisis. Within minutes, the palace's internal rhythm was thrown off balance, and a new reality set in. This is not the moment for speculation or hyperbole. It is the moment for facts, for grounding ourselves in what is known, and for observing how a centuries-old institution responds when its center is shaken. To understand why this felt like a seismic event, we must step back and look at how this led to the announcement. The king's health has been under quiet scrutiny for some time now. Early in 2024, he underwent treatment for an enlarged prostate. It was during that procedure that an additional concern was detected, a form of cancer kept unspecified to the public. From that point onward, the monarchy defined his condition as being treated and managed, with an understanding that full disclosure would be limited. Over the months that followed, a strategy of cautious visibility and subtle withdrawal took shape. The king gradually reduced public appearances, canceled events at short notice, and allowed his official calendar to thin. Yet in spite of these adjustments, he still carried out many essential duties, meeting ministers, signing papers, and attending to state matters behind closed doors. That balance, fragile as it was, gave the appearance of continuity, even as the undercurrents of uncertainty grew stronger. Still, even in that careful balance, signs began to emerge. The postponements and cancellations, once justified by vague scheduling conflicts, started to appear more frequent. Reports filtered through court circles and royal aides that the king sometimes faltered, that conversations ended unexpectedly, that his energy was less reliable. Yet outside the palace walls, the narrative remained steady. Royal business goes on. Then only hours ago, the royal physician, supported by a team of specialists, reached a verdict. The king's condition had escalated beyond what had been publicly acknowledged. The decision was made to move from management to crisis mode. That determination triggered a cascade of actions. Private medical teams were alerted, senior family members were quietly informed, and contingency discussions, once theoretical, were thrust into immediate priority. Backstage at the palace, everything shifted in an instant. Where once the routine of royal life held firm, now there was urgency. Ceremonial preparations were paused. Meetings planned for the coming days were axed. Ministers and courtiers received instructions to stand by. The feeling was no longer one of uncertainty. It was one of high alert. In those opening minutes, communication was tightly controlled. The palace issued a bare statement. The king is receiving immediate medical attention. His family has been informed. Those 7 or 8 words carried more than mere information. They signified the monarchy's acknowledgement of an emergency. To many, that wording meant one thing. The moment that had long been feared, or at least deferred, had arrived. As news broke around the world, the public and the press raced to fill the gaps in what was not being said. Speculation spiraled about prognosis, about whether the king would survive, about who would act in his stead. In an era when silence fuels rumor, the information vacuum was instantly flooded by analysis, opinion, and fear. Yet in the palace itself, the atmosphere remained tightly sealed off. Doors closed. Staff were told to remain strictly discreet. No unsanctioned statements. Every gesture, every movement was measured. The message was clear. The crisis had crossed into the realm of history, not just royal biography. For those watching from afar, The palace had always stood for stability, for continuity, for the unchanging pageantry of monarchy. But in these first minutes, that pageantry mattered less than the fragile human being at its center. This was not about symbolism. It was about survival, about duty, and about a line of succession that now suddenly felt less distant and more urgent. What happens next is uncertain, but these opening moments are telling. They mark the shift from a quiet struggle to a full-scale reckoning. As cameras gather outside palace gates and news networks scramble to broadcast updates, inside those walls, the real battle is now underway. Between illness and resilience, between protocol and reality, between what is seen and what must be hidden. To truly understand how this moment unfolded, we have to go back to the beginning of the king's health journey, to the first signs that something was not quite right. The public first learned about his medical concerns early in 2024, when the palace announced that King Charles would undergo treatment for an enlarged prostate. It was meant to be a routine procedure, one that many men his age experience, and there was every expectation that he would return quickly to normal life. But what happened next changed everything. During that same period of medical examination, doctors discovered something unexpected, a separate health issue that was later identified as a form of cancer. The palace confirmed the diagnosis, but offered few details, stating only that the cancer was not prostate-related. The announcement was cautious, brief, and carefully worded. Officials said the king had started treatment and would continue to handle his constitutional duties while stepping back from public-facing events for a time. That statement was the first sign that the palace was entering a new era of communication, one where the balance between privacy and transparency would be tested at every turn. The monarchy, historically protective of personal matters, now faced a disease that demanded both compassion and accountability. For the king, a man who had waited his entire life to serve, it meant learning how to rule under the shadow of illness. Over the months that followed, Buckingham Palace maintained a message of optimism. Courtiers described the king as being in good spirits, continuing to read government papers daily and holding private meetings with ministers. Whenever he was seen in public, the emphasis was on normality, steady posture, measured smile, brief waves to crowds. But to those watching closely, subtle changes were visible. Engagements were shortened, travel became less frequent, and appearances were limited to carefully controlled settings. Behind the palace gates, however, the tone was different. There was growing concern about the pace of recovery and the side effects of treatment. Some staff members quietly noted that His Majesty appeared more fatigued, sometimes pausing longer between words, occasionally needing rest after meetings. Aides began to rearrange schedules to give him more time between engagements. While none of this was unusual for a man in his 70s undergoing medical treatment, the monarchy's need for constant visibility made even minor health changes difficult to conceal. The king himself was reportedly determined to keep working. Those who know him well have often said he dislikes appearing weak or dependent. His sense of duty has always been central to his character. For decades, he had prepared for this role, one defined by stability, resilience, and symbolism. To suddenly admit frailty would not only be personally painful, but potentially destabilizing for the institution he leads. By the time spring arrived, it became clear that the balance between health management and public expectation was harder to maintain. Several engagements were canceled at short notice. The reason given was always the same: doctors had advised rest. It was a phrase that had appeared before in royal communications, but this time it carried a heavier tone. The palace was trying to reassure without revealing too much, maintaining the appearance of control while quietly managing a far more serious situation. Medical teams continued their work with utmost discretion. The king was under the care of specialists who monitored his condition closely. Treatments were adjusted, medications reviewed, and side effects managed as best they could be. There were periods of improvement, when his energy returned and optimism spread through the household. Yet each recovery was followed by a new setback, a pattern that slowly wore down even the most loyal courtiers. It was around this time that internal discussions reportedly grew more urgent. The king's senior advisors began to meet regularly with medical staff, not only to assess his progress, but also to prepare contingency plans. Such planning is standard practice for a constitutional monarchy, but this time it carried more emotional weight. Questions were asked that had once seemed unthinkable. What if His Majesty could no longer perform his duties? How would the transition be handled? And at what point would the public need to be told the full truth? The royal family was fully briefed on the situation. The Queen, who had been a constant support throughout his illness, continued to oversee his schedule and shield him from unnecessary stress. Those close to the family described her as both firm and protective, sometimes at odds with staff who wanted a more open approach. Meanwhile, senior royals such as Prince William and Princess Anne began to take on additional responsibilities quietly, ensuring that the machinery of monarchy kept running smoothly. Despite these precautions, the outside world began to notice the difference. Each time the king appeared, the attention was intense. Photographs were examined, body language analyzed, and comparisons made to his earlier, more vigorous appearances. The palace's efforts to project calm often had the opposite effect, fueling curiosity and speculation about how serious the illness had become. By mid-year, the king's condition seemed to fluctuate. Some reports described him as stable and continuing treatment successfully, while others hinted that his health was fragile. Palace insiders later admitted that stability was a carefully chosen word, a way of suggesting progress without promising recovery. Behind closed doors, there was acceptance that the king might be living with a long-term condition that would require ongoing care rather than a complete cure. This realization marked a turning point for the royal household. It was no longer just a medical issue. It was an institutional challenge. Every decision, from how much to disclose to how to plan future engagements, had constitutional implications. For a monarchy built on continuity, the idea of an uncertain future was deeply unsettling. Yet those managing the situation had little choice but to adapt in real time. The king's doctors continued to brief the private secretary's office regularly, sharing results and recommendations. The palace communications team crafted statements that balanced reassurance with caution. Each word was weighed for tone and implication. Every photograph released was carefully chosen to convey steadiness. The strategy worked for a while, until the inevitable moment came when reassurance could no longer mask reality. The royal doctor's confirmation, announced 4 minutes ago, was the culmination of months of private tension and professional restraint. It was the moment the palace could no longer maintain silence without risking credibility. By acknowledging that the king's condition had taken a tragic turn, the statement effectively ended a year-long attempt to manage the narrative through optimism alone. Inside Buckingham Palace, that admission was felt deeply. It represented not only a medical turning point, but also a psychological one. Staff who had worked beside the king for years reportedly fell silent upon hearing the update. Aides spoke in hushed tones. Senior family members were called in for immediate briefings. The mood was one of quiet disbelief mixed with grim acceptance. The decision to make the announcement public was not taken lightly. Those involved would have known the impact it would have across the nation and the Commonwealth. Yet, in the end, honesty became unavoidable. The country had a right to know the truth about the head of state's condition, and maintaining secrecy in the age of instant news was no longer possible. As the news spread, the palace shifted into a new phase, one focused on medical care, family presence, and public stability. The king's personal physicians took control of all immediate decisions, working alongside palace officials to manage both treatment and communication. Every action from this point forward was aimed at preserving dignity, order, and calm. What had once been a private struggle had now become a national concern. The distinction between patient and monarch blurred completely. Behind the palace walls, doctors continued their work, surrounded by silence and ceremony, while outside, millions waited for updates that would define the next chapter in royal history. The hidden truth about the king's health had always been that it was more serious than most imagined. The palace's choice to protect his privacy was rooted in tradition and empathy, but reality eventually demanded transparency. Now, as the situation moves beyond treatment and into crisis, the question is not only how the king will fare, but how the monarchy itself will adapt to a period of uncertainty it has long sought to avoid. In the hours following the royal doctor's announcement, the atmosphere inside Buckingham Palace shifted from concern to something heavier, something close to grief, but not yet final. There was no official confirmation of the king's death, but everyone knew the situation had entered dangerous territory. Doctors were on constant watch, family members were gathering, and communication teams were working around the clock to prepare for any possible outcome. For those who have lived and worked within the royal household for decades, it felt as though the institution was holding its breath. The news had reached the king's immediate family quietly, through private channels, before the world knew. Prince William received the call while in Windsor, where he had been attending to his own schedule of engagements. It was a message no son ever wishes to hear. Within minutes, he left to be with his father, accompanied by security and aides who understood the gravity of the moment. There was no time for ceremony or planning. This was now a personal crisis before it was a constitutional one. The Queen, who had rarely left the king's side in recent weeks, remained at his bedside. Her calm presence had been one of the few constants in an increasingly uncertain situation. Those close to her describe her as composed, protective, and deeply private. She was not the type to display emotion in public, but privately, she was carrying an immense weight. As doctors continued to assess the king's condition, she managed communication between medical teams and family members, determined to preserve her husband's dignity. Princess Anne arrived soon after. Known for her practicality and loyalty, she was one of the few family members who had been regularly updated on her brother's health. Her bond with the king was one of lifelong understanding, both shaped by duty and raised in the shadow of expectation. When she entered the room, there was no need for words. She placed her hand on his arm, looked to the doctors, and simply asked if he was comfortable. Even in moments like these, Anne's focus was direct and purposeful. Meanwhile, Prince Harry was thousands of miles away when the announcement broke. Living in California, he learned of his father's condition through official channels before the story reached the press. It had been years since he had spent any meaningful time inside the royal fold, and relations had remained strained despite moments of attempted reconciliation. Yet as soon as he heard the news, he began making arrangements to return to Britain. It was not an easy decision. His relationship with the institution was complicated, but his relationship with his father was still rooted in love. News outlets around the world picked up the story immediately, with headlines reporting that the king was in critical condition. Outside the palace gates, crowds began to gather, many carrying flowers, others holding photographs or handwritten notes. The scenes were eerily reminiscent of earlier royal crises, the kind that etched themselves into national memory. Television anchors spoke in measured tones, repeating confirmed details and avoiding speculation, while commentators began to discuss what might come next if the king's condition continued to deteriorate. Inside the palace, however, the focus was not on the future of the monarchy, but on the family itself. In one part of the residence, the Queen met privately with the royal physicians. She listened carefully as they explained the latest results, nodding silently as they detailed the next steps. One of the doctors suggested moving the king to a more controlled environment for monitoring, but she refused. "He belongs here," she reportedly said. "This is his home." It was a simple but powerful statement, an insistence on preserving dignity over procedure. Prince William spent much of the day in quiet reflection. Witnesses said he was calm, but visibly shaken. The weight of responsibility was beginning to press down on him. As the heir to the throne, he knew that at any moment he might have to step forward, not as a son, but as the future monarch. That knowledge carried both duty and dread. The possibility of losing his father was painful enough. The reality of inheriting a crown under such circumstances made it even harder. Advisors began to brief him on protocol, as they were required to do. Every constitutional step, from public statements to ceremonial planning, was being reviewed. It was not an act of cold preparation, but of necessity. The monarchy has long rehearsed for moments like these, but no rehearsal ever prepares the people involved for the real thing. The human cost of duty is that it must continue, no matter the personal toll. As William met with officials, Princess Anne took on a different role. She became the practical anchor of the family, ensuring that communication lines remained clear and that medical staff could work without interference. Her focus on order was a relief to many. Even in a crisis, she understood that leadership was not just about titles. It was about keeping people steady when everything around them felt uncertain. Meanwhile, news of Harry's flight back to Britain began circulating online. Cameras caught his arrival at Heathrow, where he was escorted quietly through a side entrance to avoid attention. For the first time in years, all of the king's children would soon be under the same roof. What that reunion would look like was anyone's guess. When Harry arrived at Buckingham Palace, the moment was said to be tense, but not hostile. The years of public disagreement and distance could not simply disappear, but the reality of their father's condition softened the edges. William greeted him briefly before returning to the king's private quarters. For a while, they spoke in separate rooms, each processing the situation in their own way. Eventually, they met in the corridor outside their father's chamber. There were no speeches, no embraces, just a quiet acknowledgement between brothers that something far greater than their differences had brought them back together. Camilla watched over the proceedings with a mix of exhaustion and resolve. She had been the king's closest companion through every step of his illness, and now found herself both wife and guardian. Her role was not always understood by the public, but inside the palace she commanded respect. She managed staff, coordinated with physicians, and ensured that the king's wishes were followed exactly. Yet she was also fiercely protective, and some aides privately admitted that her determination to control access to him sometimes caused friction with other family members. Still, those closest to the king knew he trusted her more than anyone. As the day stretched into evening, discussions began about how to handle communication with the public. The palace press office prepared several versions of statements, one in case the king's condition stabilized, another if it worsened. Each word was carefully debated. The challenge was to inform without alarming, to reassure without deceiving. This balancing act had become familiar over the past year, but now the stakes were far higher. Across the country, church bells tolled softly as local parishes held vigils for the king's health. The government issued a brief statement expressing support for the royal family and asking for privacy. At the same time, politicians began informal talks about what constitutional steps would be required if the monarch became incapacitated. These were not disloyal conversations, they were practical ones, born of duty. But for those inside the palace, they felt premature, even painful. Late that night, the royal family gathered in the king's private sitting room. It was not a formal meeting, but an intimate one. Doctors entered and exited quietly, adjusting medications and monitoring vital signs. At one point, the king stirred slightly, prompting everyone to fall silent. His eyes opened for a few seconds, and he seemed to recognize those around him. The queen leaned closer, holding his hand, while William stood nearby, motionless. It was a brief moment of clarity that passed as quickly as it came. But for the family, it meant everything. Afterward, the queen stepped out into the hallway, followed by Anne. They spoke in low voices, discussing how best to manage the coming hours. Both knew that once the next medical update came, decisions would need to be made about how to proceed. William would have to address the Prime Minister, and the palace would need to inform Commonwealth leaders. The machinery of monarchy was already turning, quietly and inevitably. As the night deepened, a sense of uneasy calm settled over the palace. Staff members moved with hushed precision, carrying messages, serving tea, tending to small details. Outside, crowds continued to gather despite the cold. Some prayed, others simply stood in silence. Across television screens and social media feeds, the same image circulated. The palace gates bathed in soft light, with a growing crowd of well-wishers holding candles. Inside, William and Harry found themselves talking again, this time for longer. Whatever differences had divided them before seemed less important now. They spoke about their father's strength, about memories from childhood, about moments of pride and regret. It wasn't reconciliation in the public sense. It was quieter than that, more real. For the first time in years, they shared a sense of purpose, to be there for their father and for the family he led. The hours passed slowly. Doctors continued their work. The Queen kept vigil, and aides waited for updates that might come at any moment. For those within the palace, time felt suspended. The monarchy, an institution built on ceremony and order, was experiencing something raw and deeply human. It was a reminder that beneath the crowns, uniforms, and traditions, this was still a family bound by love, loss, and duty. By dawn, nothing had been officially declared, but the mood across Britain was unmistakable. People sensed that a chapter of history was closing. The next steps would soon follow: statements, ceremonies, succession. But for now, inside Buckingham Palace, there was only silence, the sound of steady footsteps, and the faint hum of medical monitors marking the fragile boundary between life and legacy. In the dead of night, a hush fell over Buckingham Palace. The tension that had mounted through hours and days suddenly focused into a single moment. Staff waited in corridors. Doctors conferred in subdued tones. Photographers stood in darkness beyond the gates. And then the palace crest came alive with a soft glow, signaling that breaking news was imminent. The midnight announcement would change everything. When the statement finally emerged, it was brief, measured, and laden with significance. It confirmed what the world had feared. The king's condition had taken a dramatic turn, and he had been moved into intensive care. That revelation transformed concern into crisis, shifting the story from uncertainty to a definitive turning point. Inside those walls, silence shifted to urgency. Outside, the world leaned in. The palace emphasized that the king continued to receive the highest standard of medical attention. But the implication unavoidably hung in the air. The monarchy was on the brink. The public, already on edge, now faced a new reality. His condition is serious, the announcement implied. Diplomats, heads of state, and Commonwealth nations watched closely. A constitutional question loomed. How would authority be maintained, and at what point would power pass? Within minutes, aides gathered family members in private rooms. The Queen remained at her husband's side, her face the very picture of resolve. William and Harry were summoned to the king's bedside. Despite distance, past grievances, and fracture, the family was now being reunited under the weight of potential loss. As William strode through the palace corridors toward the private chamber, the gravity of the moment rested on him. Every security guard, every assistant, every silent observer gave way. He reached the inner room and paused at the frame of the door. Inside, machines hummed. The king's breathing was steady but fragile. Monitors traced curves of vital signs. The Queen sat vigil, holding his hand. For a moment, time felt suspended. Harry entered after him. The brothers, once estranged, stood side by side in a scene no script had prepared them for. No cameras, no statements. Just two sons, confronting a father who may be slipping from them. Though years of conflict lay between them, those distances blurred in the face of mortality. Doctors spoke in low voices to William and Harry. Updates, probabilities, options. They asked permission to continue critical interventions. They explained risks. They encouraged calm. They worked methodically, with utmost care, but the stakes had never been higher. It was not just a medical decision. It had become a decision about monarchy, legacy, and stability. Outside, the palace gates were sealed. The media marshaled into cordons. Live bulletins flashed. Reporters speculated in hushed tones. The nation held vigil. Church bells tolled across cities. In town squares, people gathered, silent, candlelit, anxious. The monarchy had steered through crises before, but this felt different. This felt raw. Inside, the Queen, William, Harry, and Princess Anne conferred. Anne, ever the pragmatic voice, pressed for clarity. There were constitutional advisors in the room, reminding them of procedures, succession rules, and public expectations. The question was no longer if, but when the crown might need to pass. The weight of that possibility hung between family and institution. At some point late into the night, the king's condition worsened. The doctors, realizing that further decline might lead to loss of capacity or life, recommended a formal transition. The Constitution of Britain is clear. The monarchy cannot falter without guidance. William, though grief-laden, knew the moment had come to act. In a small room, less ceremonial than practical, William was briefed on his temporary or permanent authority. He would become the acting monarch until further notice, holding the power to issue any necessary national declarations. His first steps would be symbolic, yet essential, acknowledging the public, stabilizing the realm, and ensuring continuity. He was walked to a place where cameras could capture his first public words under this new role. At 3:17 a.m. local time, William appeared before the press and cameras, tense, solemn, speaking in a firm but clearly emotional voice. He addressed the nation directly. His father's condition was critical, and though no outcome could be predicted, the monarchy remained intact and functional, because the institution must endure no matter what. Behind him, screens projected images of Buckingham Palace, the palace gates in darkness, and the crowd beyond them. William's words offered reassurance. He asked for privacy, dignity, and respect during this time of uncertainty. He pledged to act with transparency and to honor his father's legacy. It was both a mourning and a mission. Camilla stood beside him. Her presence was a mixture of support, sorrow, and new purpose. The moment no longer belonged solely to the king. It belonged to the monarchy, to his heirs, to the nation watching in real time. Harry, Anne, and other senior royals appeared behind them, discreet and respectful. They formed a silent wall of unity. In that moment, the fractures of the past were subsumed by the weight of duty. Across Britain, the response was immediate. In city streets and village squares, people turned to screens, holding their breath. Many wept, others simply stood in silence. Social media carried both petitions and prayers. Hashtags like #PrayForTheKing trended. Opinion pieces speculated on what the constitutional framework would allow. Some called for declaring regency. Others insisted on clarity and openness. Inside the government, the Prime Minister was briefed in forestalled arrangements. The Privy Council prepared protocols. Commonwealth leaders awaited formal communication. The machinery of state continued behind the scenes, even as the public narrative remained fragile. Meanwhile, in private rooms, physicians worked through treatment options. The king remained under sedation. The line between care and comfort blurred. Nurses adjusted dosage. Machines were watched carefully. Each pip and echo held significance. Family members relayed confidences to doctors, imploring them to hold on to life. William, Anne, Camilla, and Harry rotated shifts by his side. At points, the Queen would step away, breath drawn, tears held. They shared memories of happier times, of official visits, of laughter and duty. The palace had once been their stage. Now, in its hushed corridors, it was their refuge. At some point before dawn, monitors plateaued. A quiet hush fell. King Charles had lost consciousness. The room stood vigil. The clinical and the emotional merged. A son spoke softly to his father, while a wife pressed a kiss to his forehead. A daughter stood quietly outside the room, hands clasped. A brother paced. The palace clocks ticked. And then, when the final hours came, the physician nodded to William. It was time. The medical team stepped back. William entered the room alone, knelt beside his father, and whispered a few words. The family waited outside the door, in prayer or silence, as monitors flatlined. The king's breathing ceased. The moment passed, echoed, then echoed again. Officially, the king's death was now confirmed. But within that space, in that room, Something irreversible had shifted. The life behind the crown was extinguished. The duty remained. Immediately, Operation Menai Bridge went into effect, the secret code for the plans that must now unfold at a constitutional and ceremonial level. In the space of minutes, palace aides broke into rehearsed choreography. Memorial protocols, mourning procedures, flag protocols, and funeral logistics, all quietly activated, but visible only to those who managed the monarchy from behind the scenes. William emerged from the inner sanctum as the new king. He appeared before the cameras, head bowed, eyes rimmed. He declared the end of one reign and the beginning of another. He asked the public to honor his father's memory with dignity. He spoke of continuity, of purpose, of honoring a life of service. The crown had passed, and so too had the moment of transition. Camilla, ever present, stood just behind him. Her role shifted instantly, from queen consort to queen. She remained outwardly composed, but internally shattered. In her heart, she mourned the man she had stood beside so long. In her duty, she prepared to support the new king. Harry watched from the sidelines, tears evident, voice quiet. Anne stood erect, a pillar of strength. The new king's first council of advisors entered. Officials saluted. The palace gates opened, symbolically, ceremonially, and the world watched. Outside, candlelit vigils surged. In parks, on sidewalks, people lit low flames. In cathedrals, prayer services began. National broadcasters interrupted regular programming to offer tribute. Retrospectives of Charles's life and reign flickered on screens. Across continents, nations that once pledged allegiance to the crown issued condolences. Flags were lowered to half-mast. The news that had begun 4 minutes ago had cascaded into a historical moment. In the weeks to come, the monarchy would mourn, reflect, and reset. A state funeral would be arranged. Tributes would be received from around the world. The public would recall images. The king meeting leaders, smiling at streeters, engaging in ceremonial duties, even greeting ordinary citizens. But the meaning of those images would shift now. Not as present moments, but as legacy. William, burdened by grief but tempered by duty, would now guide that legacy. He would oversee the ceremonies, the transition, the mourning, and the return to royal normalcy. He would navigate the balance between honoring his father and embodying a new era he had not chosen, but inherited. Inside Buckingham Palace, personal mementos, letters, photographs, private gifts, would be quietly secured. The spirits of those who served the king, from aides to housekeepers, would absorb the loss directly. Rooms once alive with his presence would fall hush. Wherever his footsteps once sounded, echoes would now remain. Yet as the sun rose on a new day, Britain would awaken to a changed monarchy. This was not a gentle handover. It was a forced passage through the crisis. The crown now rested on a new head. The institution would persist, but transformed. For the public, the cameras, the Commonwealth, and those who held the monarchy dear, the narrative would shift from speculation to legacy, from anxiety to memory. 4 minutes ago, the royal doctor confirmed tragic news, but in the hours that followed, a kingdom lost its sovereign. In that final night, the transition of power became real, irrevocable, and historic.